we'll be presenting a work that we've been working on for quite some time now. We have this quite provocative title on it, especially being centered here in the Center for Energy Ethics, saying enough of ethics. And this is to say that perhaps the most ethical approach forward is sometimes to do less. Um, yeah, we've been this was supposed to be a work that we did for a year, and it's been prolonged. I think we've had a finished paper now for half a year that we just haven't sent anywhere because we're waiting for things to actually be set in stone and finalized. So we thought we'd take you through this little journey of putting energy sufficiency in municipal energy planning and the obstacles that we occurred along the way and kind of the deliberations that had to occur and lead out to something we think is quite useful, sustainable, and most of all equitable. Um, a little bit more about myself, or I don't really know if there's much that needs to be said, but both Erin and I are somewhat affiliated with the Center for Energy Ethics since a year back. I'll be in St. Andrews later this year, both for the Energy Ethics Conference. Well, Erin and I both will be, and I will also be staying a while longer. Most of my work revolves around energy futures and foresight, but that also follows a lot of what goes on in energy policies, contemporary debates, and it's a wide spectrum of questions. Erin, a few words about yourself, please.
Yeah. So I'm coming here today as part of Equitable Energy Research as well, which is a community interest company, as was mentioned previously, that was founded to help communities gain more knowledge on how do we transition to a sustainable energy system. And I think this work with Simon also fits into that idea of the importance of local and mesoscales in sustaining that change. So I think, we're very interested in the concept of sufficiency and how we can sort of, integrate that into local scales. And again, enough of ethics is also sort of a call for action in that direction, I think. So as you may know, this is a talk about energy sufficiency, but what do we actually mean when we talk about that? So sufficiency is a concept that remains under-considered in research in general, and debates around, for example, efficiency seem to gain more traction compared to this. And sufficiency also remains quite relegated to the individual scale, so associated to individual behaviors, as we have to reduce our consumption as individuals within a society. But in truth, we believe and we argue with this project specifically that it is necessary to understand consumption and emissions in absolute terms, and it is necessary to consider that at a wider local scale or municipal scale, for example. So for this paper, we relied on the SER framework, where S refers to sufficiency, E refers to efficiency, and R refers to renewables. And the framework is built around these three concepts, where, for example, efficiency is a term used to consider and account for energy intensity and efficiency improvements, which are generally used to produce more. So we improve the energy efficiency of a building so that we can do more with that. And in other words, it is about achieving the same result with less energy. So there is no deeper question of how much we're consuming, because that is not really the question of efficiency. And similarly, renewables are also kind of remain out with the boundaries of what sufficiency looks at, because we're creating additive effects. So we're producing more renewables without actually decommissioning, for example, previous energy forms such as fossil fuels at a similar pace. So the question of sufficiency is not a necessary part of how we we consider these other two concepts. And that is where sufficiency comes in as something that can add something more. And what it adds is this strive, and an equitable strive for reducing energy and allowing us to live within planetary boundaries, which, as hopefully we all know, are something we have to consider when we talk about energy, and also how we can sustain well-being within those planetary boundaries. So I guess sufficiency also comes with these deeper questions around the intrinsic link that exists between leading a good life as citizens, as a society, as a global society as well, so at different scales, and yeah, how do we achieve energy sufficiency at the same time as this? And for example, there has been a study from, I think it was 2019, that looked across different geographies and across 4 decades how energy consumption and well-being are related. And it found, looking at all these different countries throughout a sustained amount of time, that energy consumption is neither necessary nor directly linked to well-being. So that relationship is not one that we should consider, although the general narrative is that we need to produce more and that prosperity is abundance. So the link between, we can talk about population growth and economic development and consumption when it comes to electricity, for example, has been associated with environmental issues, but also has been under-researched as a way to find solutions to these problems. So here we want to look at sufficiency as something that can respond to these challenges and these wicked issues that exist when it comes to the intersection of all these things, and how do we grow as a society without necessarily producing more energy. And we hope that sufficiency helps us find ways to conceptualize a change that can actually help us achieve a sustainable energy system.
We're not talking about reducing energy consumption here just for the sake of reducing it. Sufficiency has been called for as a response to efficiency and renewables on their own not being sufficient. We've seen that efficiency improvements has oftentimes eaten up the gains that we saw in the first place. We've seen efficiency improvements lead to things being used more widespreadly, used to larger extents, and driving further demand for energy. And we see renewables not always replacing the fossil fuels that they were intended to replace, but rather add on top of them, such that the only transition that we see is from a share perspective, that the share of renewables is increasing. But if you look in absolute terms, that's not always the case, especially as seen from a global perspective. But writing this back a little bit, I wanted to give you some context and background to this work. We've done some conceptual work surrounding energy sufficiency, trying to make sense of it, seeing how it's used in energy and policy. But after a while, I got a bit sick and tired of always sitting in academia talking about this. So I wanted to go out and do something about it. So about 2 years ago, I gave a talk during one of our conferences, and I ended the presentation by saying, "So I'm up for grabs. Please take me away, and I'll do something cool with anyone." And Eskilstuna municipality was quite quick to grab me during the following intermission and coffee, and asked me to come and help them with their municipal energy plan, because that was something that they needed to update, because they hadn't done that in a while. I was quite familiar with energy planning by then. I had reviewed some other municipalities' work, and similarly, I was familiar with the regulations that needed to be followed, etc. So I got involved with them as a project team member, not employed by them. I was still employed by the university, and just viewing it as a collaborative research project. Quite quickly, I invited Erin to this to get a kind of as a critical friend to this work and someone to bounce my ideas with and make sure that what I'm doing was actually thought through and reasonable and equitable. So she's been a tremendous support in that, and we've been discussing this continuously throughout this project. But sufficiency wasn't maybe the entry point to this. I've always had it in the back of my head in my research, but there was something particular about municipal energy planning, and that was that in the law of municipal energy planning, it's actually stipulated that the municipality shall strive for sufficiency. It says hushållning, which is a Swedish term that's not as easy to translate. But basically what it means is sufficiency, or being sparse or sparing with resources. But despite that law, in the first paragraph of the law, I could find no examples of municipalities actually showing how they did that. I found very few examples of how such policies would be stated. So I looked through various plans and I couldn't find anything. So I wanted to figure out, how do we actually put sufficiency into practice? How do we translate it from a concept to something that we can actually work towards to help us in our energy transition? Meanwhile, there's also on a European level, there's support for sufficiency. In the Energy Efficiency Directive, there's actually a non-binding target for member states to reduce energy consumption. But something is happening in between, and on the national level, there's absolutely nothing that reflects any of those, and there's no support for it whatsoever. Right now, the current narrative is more of everything. It's double electricity consumption. It's exporting energy-intensive goods, and it's more of everything. It's the task delegated upon the Swedish Energy Agency to help capture as much production as possible. So I saw that there was tremendous opportunities for thinking about sufficiency here. And this has been a long process, as I said. It's been working together with the municipality, me from the university, but also the local energy company, of course, because they have the most agency when it comes to questions of the energy system. What the municipality actually have is only indirect power in many questions, which goes beyond their own organization and their own businesses. But they also do own the municipal energy company, so they can also go through ownership directives to facilitate certain things. So to give you a little bit more insight into how we've put this together then, and what we've arrived at thus far. As I said, we haven't sent this in anywhere because we're still waiting for the final political approval. I have a Q&A with the politicians in about a month from now that I'm looking forward to, because I have no idea what they'll ask, what they'll think, or how we will justify the targets and action points that we've created. This is the framework of the plan as it looks today. On the top left, you can see renewable, efficient, and sufficient. Those are basically focus areas that we implemented, strictly drawn from the SURF framework. We've also added for it to be resilient, because that is also a part of the requirement, or the purpose of an energy plan is to create civil preparedness in terms of an energy crisis or war, etc. We also added for it to be circular. And circular is a bit of the reason for that is that it's a niche of Eskilstuna community. They're quite famous actually for their circular initiatives, and we thought, why not bring that into energy as well? Not only talk about how we move the materials around for energy infrastructure, but also how we manage energy as a waste product, how we recycle waste heat from data centers, or how we position buildings strategically together to make use of waste heat processes. And most of the deliberations have revolved around how goals or targets are to be defined. I know that there are a lot of critiques in terms of targets. I know two different positions. One is that if you measure it, it will be gamed and exploited. I know a lot of academics here can probably reflect upon that in the academic system. But also, if you don't measure it, it doesn't happen. Or if you measure it, it does happen. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword there to some extent, and why it's really important to think about how things are measured and not monetized, but rewarded. The first kind of trade-off or compromise, might you say, that we derived that quite quickly was to not call it renewable. The Swedish government has changed that direction now. The future is supposed to be clean or fossil-free, decarbonized. It's not necessarily renewable because they want to allow for a nuclear alternative as well. We don't see much opportunities for nuclear power in the small town city of Eskilstuna, about a population of 100,000. But nevertheless, to make everyone feel comfortable, we changed renewable to fossil-free. The efficiency goal, as you know, and some of the critique that we usually start with is that efficiency goals are measured as oftentimes as energy intensity or energy use per GDP. So an efficiency improvement doesn't necessarily indicate a savings of energy, but rather an increased economic outputs. So one of the things we managed to arrive at there, we try laying forth an efficiency requirement in absolute terms, saying that 1.9% of energy consumption should be reduced every year. But that was seen as an obstacle to certain industrial establishments. And their arguments was that, well, this will create jobs, this will create opportunities, more people living here. And then we arrived at the trade-off. Well, okay, if you actually bring the jobs, if you bring the people, then of course it will be a higher energy consumption. So we arrived at it being an efficiency improvement per capita, not per GDP, but per people living in Eskilstuna. And the sufficiency targets, which was directly supposed to be relating to sufficiency, but what I forgot to mention was that sufficiency can be seen throughout all of these different focus areas, especially efficiency and resilience and circular. So what we said initially for a sufficiency target was that let's strive to reduce our energy consumption by X amount, quite a lot, following the Energy Efficiency Directive, the non-binding targets of the European Commission. But that was also quite seen as not being well accepted by politicians and industry. So after many backs and forths, what we arrived at, and still pending, but where we're at right now is saying that final energy consumption shall not increase or shall decrease, basically same thing. And that just provides a cap on how much energy we're kind of allowed to play around with. For the preparedness section, we established 100% self-sufficiency targets up from around 36% today, and this is all targeting 2045. Alongside that, of course, there's also action points focusing on creating storage solutions and preparedness plans and rationing plans, etc. And the final one, circular. We didn't find a good way of measuring waste heat utilization, so rather this became circularity of carbon emissions, basically, and the different forms of carbon sequestration that might become needed, but also putting a cap on that and saying that we should not use, at least not in the first hand, carbon capture, utilization, and storage, but rather purely storage to really capture the offsetting effects of such technologies. Alongside that, there are some action points that delineate more what is said to need to be done in this plan, not just what we measure, but what we do, such as counteracting energy poverty. It's not a big issue today in Sweden as far as we know, but we want to be proactive about it. We see that energy inequality is becoming a rising issue, both in terms of security, and only some have are prepared for an energy crisis or even worse. We see that only a few and those affluent reap the benefits of the energy transition, whereas others are stuck in more costly systems. But we wanted to get back a little bit to this question of what actually energy sufficiency is, because I think we've, or at least I've, started to problematize what it even means. In Sweden, we've had a stable electricity consumption for the last 40 years. Some may say that that is a sufficient level, that this basically it hasn't grown. But what we've seen is that efficiency improvements have allowed for growth in a lot of sectors. For instance, take the building sector. We've constantly built new buildings, but they've been more efficient than the previous building stock, and our current building stock has at the same time been invested in to make it more efficient. And that has resulted in a stable energy consumption, perhaps a sufficient level thereof. So that we see, and this kind of compromise that we arrived is that efficiency and sufficiency go very well hand in hand if applied in unison. If you only do efficiency, you can see consumption go up as a consequence, but coupled together, you can get a sufficient system. And that way, it also becomes easier to achieve an energy transition. If you're not simultaneously growing, it becomes a lot easier to replace what you rely on. See if I can get but the question here then becomes, what is actually sufficiency? Is it having a stable line forward, or is it actually decreasing? Because if you are to uphold the same social welfare, but continuously improve upon a system which does so, you could expect to see a declining demand for energy. But as this sort of compromise kind of lifts this up and allows for development and growth within that cap that is placed. But perhaps even this is not sufficient. Perhaps we're already above the threshold of what is our planetary boundaries in this, and perhaps it should be even lower, this bound. Or there's also other arguments that, for instance, we're heavily reliant on imported energy-intensive goods. Just look at the ammonia and green fertilizers that we want to create is something currently imported. And if we are to become self-sufficient, not only in energy, but also in food production, we would actually need to increase our energy consumption. So perhaps this bound is actually found higher than we're at today. So there's a lot of science that needs to go into finding out where we actually need to land. I mean, from a political perspective, we see that going down is very not well received, and for reasonable, we shouldn't decrease just for the sake of decreasing. There's no point in that. This all comes down to a more equitable and sustainable system in the end, removing those how do you say it, inequalities in consumption, and that goes beyond the municipal perspective. That goes to a national and international perspective of what is a sufficient level of energy consumption. So there's a lot of questions here that I don't have the answers to yet. A lot of this work was done last year, and I got new data for the energy consumption just a few weeks ago, and we saw an immense spike in electricity consumption in Eskilstuna the last year, which I have yet to explain. But I'm trying to figure out whether or not is a weird one-off tendency or a new trend that we're on a very different trajectory from what we have anticipated. So that's also just some food for thought.
I'm kind of stepping away from the whole political process that Seymour has been involved in, looking more at the ethical questions that emerge when we try to put sufficiency in practice. And obviously, yeah, we spoke earlier on about the fact that sufficiency is also tied to what we define as a good life, what we define as well-being, what we define as positive development. So obviously it's tied to all these political and ethical questions that have to be kind of grounded in the reality as well. So yeah, I'll start by saying that some of the existing scenarios that we are looking at also rely on energy abundance and don't really problematize or question the fact that we use so much energy at different scales, nor consider the limits of these practices. So with this paper, we've tried to argue that rather than looking at the technocratic solutions, and there are solutions that try to kind of limit energy consumption, but or rather the effects of energy consumption, we require more radical and ethical shifts to enable a good life to happen within planetary limits. And yeah, so the main assumptions of sort of the ethics of endless economic growth as it is today are largely accepted and are founded on assumptions that can be seen as historical. And for example, it relies on the anthropocentric view that humanity is at the center and nature is a resource to be used by humanity, that the free market will provide the best outcomes for humans to benefit from, and that it will regulate, in a way, the economics of resource consumption, and that the business as usual economy can grow endlessly. So there are no limits to the resources that we use. And this follows a historical trajectory, which means, yeah, consuming more and more and more. And also it is founded on the weak sustainability principle, as it is called, that all capital can be substituted and fundamental economic ecosystem services that support human societies can be replaced by monetary means. So sort of technical fixes is what we're talking about. And there is a body of research that pairs the economic system that we live in to directly to climate change and economic damage, for example, environmental damage, for example. And this is something that is also supported by the notion of sustainable development, where GDP rates, for example, are viewed as promoters of more sustainable societies or economies, for example. So there is a real need to shift away from the current economic order and structures that exist to actually integrate sufficiency in a meaningful way, because otherwise it will just be taking these sort of backlogs, ideological and sort of philosophical backlogs into the present and the future. And yeah, just to quote something by Karim Zadeh and Bostrom, in their words, we're living in an economic system that is wired towards profit, stakeholder values, capital accumulation, market competition, consumerism, and the rapid turnover of products, as well as a dominant ideological mindset that favors green growth and technological fixes. And this is the context within which we're trying to propose sufficiency as a way forward. And sufficiency is a way to also break away from the structures and the values that have led to an economic system and that has affected both people and environment in negative ways as well. Because again, we spoke about how sufficiency is also centered in finding equitable outcomes as well. So in our work, we have also summarized sort of, yeah, moved from the municipal view, which has been a sort of case study also for how sufficiency can be put into practice, to also question the broader structures that exist and sort of what this shift would look like. So what would the ethics of doing less or consuming less would look like? And we have summarized them in this way, where the first thing is that enough is enough, and that we need to address the difficult question of consumption, because that is not happening. And there is a need to also recognize that the notion of green growth is a contradiction in terms, in a way where green growth can be proposed as a business as usual scenario, where we don't really need to question the deeper problems that exist within the economic system and the notion of development that we currently have. Where it is about adding more, we can add renewables on top, which become an additive sort of thing, rather than an actual shift in where our energy comes from, which we could argue it hasn't happened fully yet. And there's also a need to recognize the intrinsic value of natural resources, as well as all the different values and plural sort of worldviews that are tied to them. And Simon has an awareness of this, talking to the different stakeholders. I think he was talking about how utility companies might have very different values or understandings of these natural resources, for example, to communities that live in these places, or so we have to also take into account these differences. And also there is a need to take space and time into account when we talk about sufficiency. So, for example, what does this mean for intergenerational justice? What are the intergenerational costs of the current consumption paradigm, and how can we ensure that that we're not stealing from the future in a way, or colonizing the future, as the author of The Good Ancestor said. And there is also a need to consider ethics in space. And from a colonial justice perspective, for example, we're talking about this municipality in Sweden, but we cannot ignore the fact that all the resources, a lot of the resources we're talking about, even when it just comes to the energy technologies, are heavily reliant on extracting in places, not just in the global north, but also in the global south. So there are often very exploitative and extractive relationships there that need to be considered and addressed. And that sufficiency can provide some answers or ways towards the solutions, for example. And again, there's a need to take a local perspective where the global and the local come together in a way, and these tensions are mitigated by taking into account the different scales at which change happens. So, to summarize everything, we have argued that sufficiency is key to addressing the challenges of resilience, equity, and sustainability, which is in itself a wicked problem to try and find a solution to all of those. And the most ethical way forward that we envision is sufficiency, which allows to, again, fill the gap that other sort of solutions don't really fill. Local actors such as the Eskilstuna municipality play an important role in operationalizing rapid and ambitious policies in support of sufficiencies. So change doesn't start top down, but can also go from the ground up or from the middle up. There is a need to build stronger relationships and an understanding of relationships when it comes to having conversations around sufficiency as well, and the values that underpin our understanding of what well-being and growth should look like. So planning is a process, not a product, and it is a relational thing as well. And that the ethics of green growth must be called into question to promote truly sustainable and fair energy systems. So what is deemed as business as usual is not so straightforward.
I want to give a quick shout out to some of the other things that we're working on before we close this up for questions and discussions. We will be in St. Andrews later this year for the Energy Ethics Conference, where we'll be sharing a session on energy futures and foresights, to which we will also are working on a very comprehensive paper reviewing all of the work that goes into that from an ethical perspective and a planning perspective and a technological perspective, that we're also open to collaborators on. It's quite a comprehensive work, but I just want to flag for that if that's of interest to anyone. And I'll also be in St. Andrews for a prolonged period, or at least around 2 months. So I'm also looking for things to do whilst I'm there. So look forward to meeting any of you who's in Scotland, at least, when we're there. So thank you very much.